Russia has had a very long and complex history, but at the time of this writing, its modern iteration is that of an oligarchic petro-state, meaning it makes the vast majority of its money from oil, mineral, coals, and mainly gas. After the fall of the USSR, it transitioned into a totalitarian dictatorship with a comprehensive cult of personality around the Kremlin, becoming a state run by around 100 extremely rich individuals, being the imperial oligarchs running it, which got morbidly wealthy via extracting the blood of the earth so they could set fire to the biome for profit, and consolidating around one centralized authority, with most to all of the president in name only, who's really a dictator's, members of their cabinet, composed of those oligarchs. Much of Russia is a vast unused tundra or a barren land, with the majority of its populace being somewhat low income, peasants if you will, with a weak middle class. But like with all of the most corrupt countries, the majority of the Russian people don't want or comply with their country's way of doing things, because there is a massive disconnect always between what the people want and what the oligarchic dark sorcerer wants. So the Kremlin still has to pretend it operates democratically. This is where propaganda comes in, to sway the hearts and minds of the people away from their own middle-class interests of government working primarily for them, into it working only for the interests of the morbidly rich. So everything there in modernity is still top-down just as it was in the dark ages of queens and kings, where back in the day if they didn't like you it was overtly off with your head in the town square, and now if they don't like you it's just having you disappear overtly. So what is the media like in Russia? Short of what is underground, all public Russian media is state-sanctioned by the oligarchs, for the oligarchs, and only to benefit the oligarchs. So as a result, it's a 24/7 lie machine and is complete 100% state-sanctioned Kremlin propaganda, with zero journalistic oath, complete lies and mind control from the top of the hierarchy down to seek lies and spread them, maximize harm, act on behalf of power structures to prevent their accountability, and are opaque in doing so, making those who hate liberal democracy proud. The problem with oligarchy is that it only represents less than 0.01% of the population, thereby 99.9% is not represented. And in the United States, because of 40 plus years of Reaganomic trickle-down golden shower austerity measures, doing their part to try and destroy the middle class and thus democracy, we are left with the most massive lopsided distribution of wealth since the robber baron era, and see the website lcurve.org on the subject. So we certainly are better than Russia, but have been heading towards that model. As a result, Russia has become a global leading-edge hub of far-right political and media influence throughout the world because the right wing's main goal throughout the world is to protect extreme corruption, wealth hierarchy, and corporate greed, and is why we shit on it 85% of the time over the left, so you're welcome. Every regressive, liar, extractor, and authoritarian, modern iterations of which are ultranationalists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, regressive reactionaries, propagandists, grifters, etc., end up adopting a very pro-Russian style of language. And Putin literally said they are all welcome to immigrate to Russia as a haven from Western liberality, progressivism, and freedom. Russian oligarchs have spent undaunting amounts of money, not on helping their own people, because they don't care about their own people, let alone on other countries' people, let alone on indigenous people, because instead using that to put into intelligence work, manipulating the global narrative. This goes for all authoritarian petrostates. Saudi Arabia is basically no different, which is reason 6,321 why we need to transition away from fossil fuels, because they have been the finance machines for dictatorships throughout the world. Bipartisan corruption in Washington, D.C. is certainly nothing new, but no one does corruption like the Grand Old Party. They are the leading edge of it. When Richard Nixon's administration was in scandal and shambles leading to his resignation in the late 1960s, at the time the Fairness Doctrine was still in place before the Republicans at the FCC killed it. Thus he was forced out because the Fourth Estate did its job as a check on corrupt power. But in the 1970s, propagandist, sexual assaulter, and Jabba the Hutt-style slug human Roger Ailes wrote a memo, which was later to be rediscovered in Nixon's presidential library, which proposed how to circumvent the prejudices of network news and deliver pro-administration stories to heartland television viewers. In this case, prejudices meant truth and pro-administration meant lies. So that in the future, after the Fairness Doctrine had been abolished under the auspices of free speech, sound familiar, a future Nixon-esque president could not have the Fourth Estate doing its job against their corruption, but instead be the opposite. A media ecosystem echo chamber to constantly back up the corruption and amplify their lies, injecting a far-right slant to gradually, subtly, and slowly inject their philosophy into the news. The network was, in the words of a news director who then quit in protest, a propaganda machine. Today, watching more than 15 minutes of Fox News will turn your brain to goo. If you're well-loved, well-traveled, and formally well-educated, or even well-educated and as an autodidact, it's extremely unlikely you'd have the great misfortune of doing that in the first place. But to the unloved, untraveled, and uneducated, and most of all weak-willed and gullible, it's hate fuel. As Rolling Stone says, to watch even an hour of Fox News, the anger, the bombast, the virulent paranoid streak, the unending appeals to white resentment, the reporting that's held to the same standards of evidence as a late October attack ad, is to see a refraction of its founder, one of the most skilled and fearsome operatives in the history of Republican politics, Roger Ailes. As a political consultant, which is really just a marketer, Ailes repackaged Richard Nixon for television in 1968, papered over Ronald Reagan's budding Alzheimer's in 1984, shamelessly stoked racial fears to elect George H.W. Bush in 1988, and waged a secret campaign on behalf of Big Tobacco to derail healthcare reform in 1993. But an examination of his career reveals that Ailes used Fox News to pioneer a new form of political campaign, one that enabled the GOP to bypass skeptical reporters and wage an around-the-clock, partisan assault on public opinion. The network, at its core, became a soundstage created to mimic the look and feel of a news operation, cleverly camouflaged political propaganda as independent journalism. The result became one of the most powerful political machines in American history, one that has played a leading role in defining regressive talking points and advancing the agenda of the far right. As for actual journalists, fuck 'em, Ailes said. It's not a press conference. It's a television show, our television show, and the press has no business on the set. This is also the precise reason why we need middle-class media over heavy Russian-style oligarchic-owned media, which is fascistic propaganda heavy. In the United States, and this also applies to Murdoch-owned media in parts of Europe and Australia, networks such as Sky, Fox, Breitbart, Washington Times, etc., although Andrew Breitbart was actually somewhat of a real journalist uncovering scandalous things about the Clintons and John Podesta, for example, the more right-wing, the more untruthfully lying with every breath modern propaganda networks they have become with no journalistic integrity. And that's not even talking about the full-on straight-up MAGA fascist networks such as OAN, Newsmax, and Truth Social, really Lies Social, which are even worse. Put them on the same level as Russian state media with 100% lies and only some occasional micro cracks of truth. While more supposedly centrist things such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, CNN, ABC, etc. are better but still very corporatist both sides between truth and lies light, which normalize fascistic behavior because they are also owned by only slightly nicer members of the bourgeoisie. And even MSNBC, which is the only legacy network that leans forward thinking, which could be called MSDNC because it's the most pro-middle class and thus pro-democracy, corporate news, still is very 50-50 truth and is not going to tell full-on truthful things, such as challenging America's international imperial doings. We know someone in New York who worked at Fox News, doing graphics for the network, and said most employees there, while sometimes being treated well, while also for many of the fash-plast platinum blondes who had to deal with the toxic misogynist work environment, the majority of those employees knew the whole thing was not much different than The Onion, which is a satirical comedic newspaper. where most of them, meaning those who literally work there, while appreciating their job security, viewed it like a big joke machine selling only hate and fear, and did not think well of their audience, who are primarily crusty old regressive people whose grown children want nothing to do with them because they are so hard-locked in their ways of sexism, racism, and xenophobia. With the on-screen talking heads at Fox, so-called news, having zero journalistic integrity, not fighting the man, but instead working for the man, knowing they are lying for the money. The owners of the network as well all know that their business model is constant lies, as evident by Fox so-called news paying out $787.5 million in a lawsuit to Dominion Voting Systems in 2023 for spreading lies, which they knew were lies, caused to get ratings about non-existent outcome determinative fraud in the 2020 election, and not in a million years putting any of the Murdochs on the stand. So the American right wing has spent nearly half a century putting forth little to no policies that do anything for the middle class, let alone the poor, but instead giving the already morbidly rich, wealthy tax cuts at the expense of the American people, while building a right-wing lie machine media empire to nonstop lie to those same people. And today, some 70 million red Americans are blanketed from morning, noon, and night with nonstop fash propaganda that was constructed by the bourgeoisie godzillionaires to distract them from the fact that they are getting robbed blind by those same bourgeoisie. Talk radio, TV news, Russian bot farms, Telegram, hundreds of video channel and podcast new media grifters, and now Twitter with the stupid new name, are all there solely and exclusively to stack lies on top of lies. Where if you're not mainlining the propaganda, you hear the dumbest, obviously blatantly nonsensical things, such as Giga Chad MS-13 Mexican rapists are coming for your Caucasian trad wives, or every shooter is not a fear-based gun nut like they obviously are, but instead purple or blue-haired transsexuals, or kids are using litter boxes in schools, or Haitian voodoo is eating our pets, and can't believe you live in a country where your fellow countrymen can even remotely begin to think any of that is real. So why is America so polarized today? Simple explanation. Because the results of Roger Ailes' style of propagandistic media business model. Time to bring back the fairness doctrine.